Welcome to my channel Karma Romance Stories. Please like, subscribe for more videos.
At Thanksgiving, my father stood at the head of the table and announced that he had sold our family business for $50 million. My brothers and sisters immediately started celebrating because they believed they were finally going to receive their share of the family fortune. Then my father looked directly at me and said that I was getting nothing. I smiled and asked one simple question: Dad, who is the buyer? He proudly answered Everest Holdings. The room erupted with excitement. Nobody noticed that I had stopped eating. Nobody knew that Everest Holdings was not a stranger. It was my company. And when I finally said, Dad, I am Everest Holdings, the room went completely silent. The voice you selected does not support this language. Please click the upper right corner to switch to another voice. My name is Emily Carter, and for most of my life, I believed that being part of a family business meant being part of the family itself. My father, Daniel Carter, had built Carter Industrial Supply from almost nothing. When I was a child, our house was filled with stories about warehouses, customers, employees, deliveries, and business deals. My father always told us that the company was more than a business. He called it our family legacy. My older brother Jason believed the company belonged to him because he was the oldest son. My younger brother Michael believed he deserved a position because he had always been close to Dad. My sister Rachel rarely talked about the company, but whenever money came up, she somehow knew exactly what she expected to receive. And then there was me. I was the daughter who was never taken seriously. When I was 18, I told my father that I wanted to learn every part of the business. He smiled and told me that business was not something I needed to worry about. When I graduated from college with a degree in finance, I asked him if I could work in the company. He told me that there were already enough family members working there. So I left. I did not leave because I hated my family. I left because I realized that if I stayed, I would always be the daughter asking for permission. I started working for a small investment company. At first, I was doing basic financial analyses. Then I learned about acquisitions. I learned how companies were valued. I learned how investors studied cash flow, debt contracts, employees, customers' assets, and future growth. Most importantly, I learned something my father had never taught me. A company is not valuable simply because a family owns it. A company is valuable because of what it can produce and in what someone is willing to pay for it. Over the next several years, I worked harder than anyone expected. I became involved in acquisitions. I learned how to negotiate. I learned how to read financial statements. I learned how to recognize businesses with strong fundamentals but poor management. And eventually, I started my own investment company. I called it Everest Holdings. I chose the name because I wanted to remind myself that the biggest mountains are climbed one step at a time. I never told my family, not because I wanted revenge, because I wanted to build something that belonged entirely to me. Meanwhile, Carter Industrial Supply continued growing. My father became increasingly convinced that my brothers were his natural successors. Jason received a senior management position. Michael received control over several major accounts. Rachel started handling some of the company finances. Whenever I visited, I could see what was happening. My brothers were being prepared for ownership. I was being treated like a guest. One Thanksgiving, everything changed. The entire family gathered at my parents' house. The dining room was decorated beautifully. My mother had prepared the traditional Thanksgiving dinner. There was turkey, mashed potatoes, vegetables, pies, and every dish our family had eaten for years. My father waited until everyone was seated. Then he stood up. He raised his glass. Everyone became quiet. Dad said that he had an important announcement. Jason immediately smiled. Michael looked excited. Rachel whispered that she knew something big was happening. My father looked around the table and said that Carter's Industrial Supply had been sold. For a few seconds, nobody spoke. Then Jason asked, "How much?" My father smiled. $50 million. Everyone started talking at once. My mother covered her mouth. Michael laughed. Rachel started calculating what she believed her share would be. Jason raised his glass and said this was the best Thanksgiving ever. Then my father lifted his hand. He said there was one more thing. He explained that the buyer was Everest Holdings. I nearly dropped my fork. Everest Holdings? My company. But nobody at that table knew. My father continued. He said the transaction had been negotiated privately and that the family would no longer own the company. Then he looked at me. His expression changed. He said, "Emily, you need to understand something. You're getting nothing from this sale." The room became uncomfortable. I looked at him and asked why. He said that I had never worked for the company. He said Jason and Michael had spent years helping build the business. He said Rachel had supported the family. Then he said that I had chosen to leave. My brothers smiled. They thought I had been defeated. Jason leaned back in his chair and said that Dad had made the right decision. Michael laughed and said that I should have stayed if I wanted a piece of the company. I looked at my father. Then I asked, "Dad, who is the buyer?" He smiled proudly. "Everest Holdings." I nodded slowly. Then I said something that nobody expected. "Dad, I am Everest Holdings." Nobody moved. My father stared at me. Jason stopped smiling. Michael put his glass down. Rachel looked confused. My mother asked what I meant. I explained that Everest Holdings was the investment company I had founded. My father thought I was joking. He asked me to stop playing games. I reached into my bag and placed a folder on the table. I told him that the acquisition agreement was real. The company was being purchased by Everest Holdings. But there was something else. The buyer was not giving money directly to the family members. The transaction had been structured according to the ownership documents and negotiated terms. My father had spent months believing he was negotiating with an outside buyer. He had never realized that the person on the other side of the negotiation was his daughter. The silence was almost unbearable. Jason finally asked if I had planned this. I told him no, I had not planned to buy my father's company. I had planned to build my own company. The opportunity came when I discovered that Carter Industrial Supply was being offered for sale. At first, I ignored it. Then I reviewed the financial information. The company had excellent customers, strong contracts, experienced employees, a valuable distribution network, but it also had serious management problems. The business had potential. The problem was leadership. I told my father that I had not bought the company because I wanted to embarrass him. I bought it because I believed I could make it better. My father asked how I could afford $50 million. I explained that Everest Holdings had investors and financing arrangements. The purchase was not a suitcase full of cash. It was a serious business transaction involving valuation financing, due diligence contracts, and legal agreements. That distinction mattered. My father looked at me and asked why I'd never told him. I answered honestly, "Because every time I tried to prove myself to you, you told me I did not belong." My mother began crying. Jason became angry. He said I had stolen their inheritance. I told him that I had stolen nothing. I had purchased a company that was legally offered for sale. He said Dad had promised them the business. I looked at my father. Dad had promised them something, but a promise was not the same as ownership. That was the moment the conversation became much bigger than money. My father admitted that he had always expected Jason to eventually take over. He believed Michael would have a major role. He thought Rachel would receive part of the wealth, and he assumed I had moved on. He never imagined that the daughter he considered least interested in the business had spent years learning how businesses actually worked. I told my family that I was not going to fire everyone. I was not going to punish my brothers. I was not going to destroy the company just to prove a point. Instead, I offered them something they had never expected: a chance. I told Jason that if he wanted to continue working for the company, he could apply for a position based on qualifications. The same rule would apply to Michael and Rachel. No family privilege. No automatic ownership. No special treatment. Everyone would be judged by performance. Jason became furious. He said that I was treating my own family like strangers. I answered that the company had to be treated like a business if it was going to survive. This was not just my opinion. Research on family businesses repeatedly shows that succession and ownership decisions can create serious conflict when roles and expectations are not clearly established. Recent family business research also emphasizes that selling a family company involves questions of control, fairness, identity, relationships, and legacy in addition to financial value. Family business plus two? My father looked down at the table. Then he asked the question I had been waiting years to hear. Was I proud of what I had accomplished? I looked at him. I told him yes, but I also told him that I would have been happier if he had believed in me before I had to prove everything without him. That sentence changed his expression. For the first time that evening, my father looked less like a businessman and more like a father who suddenly realized how much he had missed. He apologized. Not dramatically, not perfectly, just quietly. He said he had made assumptions about me. He said he believed sons were better suited to carry the business, and he admitted that he had been wrong. I did not immediately forgive him. Forgiveness is not something that can be forced simply because everyone is sitting around a Thanksgiving table, but I told him that I was willing to start again. The following months were difficult. The acquisition went through. Everest Holdings became the new owner. I spent months studying the company from the inside. I met employees. I reviewed contracts. I listened to customers. I examined every department, and slowly I discovered something important. The company was not failing because the employees were bad. It was failing because the family had confused ownership with leadership. Some people had been promoted because they were relatives. Some decisions had been made because Dad wanted to keep peace. Some employees had stopped speaking honestly because they were afraid of offending a family member. I changed that. I introduced professional performance standards. I hired independent advisors. I created clear reporting structures. And I established one rule. Nobody would receive a position simply because of their last name. My brothers were given opportunities to compete for roles. Jason eventually accepted a position after completing an evaluation process. Michael decided to leave and start his own company. Rachel remained involved with the family finances, but no longer expected an automatic share of the business. My father retired. At first, he struggled with the idea that he was no longer in control, but eventually, he started visiting the company again, not as the owner, as my father. One afternoon, we stood together inside the warehouse. He looked around at the employees and the machinery. Then he looked at me. He said that he had spent his entire life trying to build something his children could inherit, but he had forgotten to teach us how to build something ourselves. I smiled. I told him that maybe the real inheritance was not the company. Maybe it was the lesson that family should never be used as a substitute for fairness. The lesson that children should not have to beg for belief from their parents. And the lesson that sometimes the person everyone underestimates is the person quietly preparing for the biggest moment of their life. A year after the Thanksgiving announcement, I returned to my parents' house. We had Thanksgiving dinner again. This time, there was no business announcement, no inheritance argument, no secret deal, just family. My father raised his glass. He looked at me and said, something I will never forget. To Emily, the daughter I thought needed the family business. But who built a business of her own? Everyone smiled. I looked around the table. For the first time in years, nobody was competition. Nobody was calculating. Nobody was waiting to see who would get more. We were simply a family. And that was worth more than $50 million. The voice you selected does not support this language. Please click the upper right corner to switch to another voice. Sometimes, the greatest revenge is not taking something away from the people who underestimated you. Sometimes it is becoming so strong that you no longer need their approval. My father thought he was announcing the end of my connection to the family business. Instead, he unknowingly announced the beginning of my greatest chapter. He thought Everest Holdings was a company he was selling to a stranger. He never imagined that the person sitting across from him at the Thanksgiving table had already climbed the mountain he told her she could never climb. And when the room went silent after I said, "Dad, I am Everest Holdings," I finally understood something. I had not spent all those years trying to win my father's business. I had spent those years building a life that could never be taken away from me.